Hey, what's going on, everybody, and welcome back once again. My name is Jordan, also known as JMonster, and I want to thank you guys for joining me for another replay battle. This one was sent in to me by Von Mountain, and of course we are playing Napoleon Total War 2. I think that's obvious. And he sent this to me quite some time ago, and I intended to have it up many weeks in the past, but I wasn't really able to, obviously. So thank you very much to Von Mountain for his patience with me, and yeah, hope you guys enjoy this battle. It's really good. So Von Mountain is going to be playing as the Russians, and he'll be facing off against the Prussians today, which I'm sure is going to be terribly confusing for me. His army consists predominantly of musketeers. I believe he's got 7 or 8 battalions of these musketeers, and both of the wings of his army are supported with two reserve units of cavalry, predominantly Uhlans. We've got 3 units of the Uhlans here, which are a Lancer Cav, and a couple companies of Opel here in the center. I believe there's 3 of them in total, to add to the numbers of Von Mountain's army, and that's probably helping him afford the extra cavalry as well. He's got a general staff, where his general is going to be hanging out, of course. There's the 3rd company of Uhlans, and then over here on his left, he's got 1 unit of the Pavlograd Hussars. I'm not really sure about the minute differences between the various units of cavalry in Napoleon Total War. This is a game I'm a little bit less familiar with. But I believe the Hussars have greatly improved melee stats at the cost of charge. So, pretty sure that's how it works. Don't quote me on that. But in any case, that is going to be Von Mountain's army. A lot of numbers, some lower, I would say lower quality overall than what we're going to see from the Prussians, but it does make a nice matchup of quality versus quantity. That being said, let's go ahead and see what the Prussian player has brought to the battle today. On the other side of the valley, we have the army of Prussia, and this army is being commanded by Section, a friend of Von Mountain's. And he's brought, I believe, 7 companies of musketeers, but instead of militia reserves, he's got 3 units here of grenadiers. And as their name would suggest, they can toss grenades that do damage and cause morale shocks to whatever they hit. So really, really nice quality heavy infantry formation. He's also got a general staff, because who doesn't in Napoleon, and just 2 companies of Prussian Lancers. So the cavalry advantage here is firmly in the court of the Russians, whereas when it comes to the quality of their infantry, the Prussians have the advantage here. So it'll be interesting to see that dynamic at play in this battle. So we've got a nice and even balanced bar. Let's go ahead and let's get this started. And so the Prussians are going to move forward into this dale here, and I think both sides are going to be jockeying for a lot of position in the center. There's a lot of high ground here, a lot of like terraced hills and such that can be very, very useful when fighting off enemy infantry, helping to get just a large volume of fire when you've got these tiered hills like this, because you can just get so many units firing at once with no concern of line of sight. But the Russians, I think, are going to be the first into this hilly area, as they had deployed a little bit closer. So a small advantage there given to the Russian player Von Mountain earlier on into the game. Let's take another look here at the disposition of both armies. Because I imagine because of the less mobile nature of his army, having less cavalry, the Prussian player has opted to kind of stick together with the majority of his infantry in the center, formed up into 2 lines with his cavalry sometimes on the wings, and I imagine he can deploy his second line as reserves to support his cavalry whenever needed, whereas Von Mountain has taken a much wider formation and looks like he's probably going to try and envelop the Prussians, wanting them to move into this hilly area so that he can use the terrain to his advantage, surround the Prussians on the heights, and blast them into submission, which is a good strategy. There is certainly a danger of spreading himself too thin, and you can see a lot of Russian troops here, perhaps even too many Russian troops, forming up on Von Mountain's right wing, and it's looking like this is all going to be a flanking force. So about half, if not more than half, of his musketeer corps, along with some Opel and a couple units here of cavalry, have formed up here to be a flanking force. And over here in the center and on his left is really more of like a skeleton holding force. Something to try and pin the Prussians into position while he comes down with the hammer of the majority of his forces, infantry and cavalry, on the opposite wing. And we'll see how that works out for him. Speaking of being a little bit thinly spread, you can see some musketeers here, along with a company of the Pavlograd Hussars. Wow, that was really hard for me to say. I want to say Hospitaliers, but that's like 500 years or so too late at this point. In any case, so the musketeers here with the Pavlograd Hussars guarding this pass. This could potentially be a very important pass. If the Prussians are able to take one or more of these choke points here that the Russians have set themselves up in, they will be able to roll up the Russian line and then obliterate this force and then turn around to face the remainder of the Russian forces with the full might of their army. And I imagine, given the numbers disparity between the two here, if the Prussians were to move forward quickly, this could be an easy thing for them to accomplish. There's only 3 units of musketeers here and a couple companies of cavalry in reserve, but it's not going to be enough to hold back a determined Prussian assault. Let's see what we have over here. Looks like the Prussian Lancers see an opportunity here, and they're going to rush for those musketeers just after they get themselves into position. Von Mountain is going to see it, however, and drop himself into Cavalry Square. For those of you unfamiliar with Napoleon Total War and its formations and tactics, the Cavalry Square is the lifeblood of any infantry unit when it comes to facing off against a cavalry charge. When you've got a couple companies of Prussian Lancers barreling towards your position, this is your default go-to. It just helps for reasons that I don't particularly understand the mechanics of, but this is something that was used in history to help infantry stand up to mass cavalry charges, and it is very, very effective in Napoleon Total War. Unless the square gets broken, in which case it's chaos and horror. So the Prussian Lancers were driven back, but Prussia is moving forward with a couple companies of grenadiers here, and this is going to give them a 2-to-1 advantage in both cavalry and infantry. And there's not really a ton that Von Mountain can do about this. If you look at his deployment so far, pardon me, I'm a little bit sick and sneezy. If you look at his deployment so far, he can't really break off infantry reserves to try and help these guys, because it opens up his lines. It'll cause a break in his formation, and the Prussians will potentially be able to just charge right through that, which is exactly what they're trying to do over here. Ooh, nasty. Looks like the musketeers got caught up in a cavalry charge from both of their units, getting bowled over by their own troops at the same time as they're being ridden down by the Prussian Lancers. And the Pavlograd Hussars are going to take that on the chin, and that is... It's going to break this unit of musketeers here. In fact, they are going to shatter. So that is a massive hole that has just been punched in Von Mountain's line by the Prussians. Excellent work here on the part of Section. He zeroed in on this right away, and and applied the appropriate pressure necessary. Didn't overcommit. This is everything that he needed in order to break through here. Oop. Some of the Russian Uhlans were coming in to help, but it looks like they might get caught up by the Grenadiers. A few shots here are going to claim the lives of a few of the Uhlans as they retreat, and that's so far been a disaster for Von Mountain. And of course, that is going to oblige him now to retreat his line and go on to the defensive. His troops over on this end are certainly taking their time and getting into position. Doesn't want to just run them through the hills because that will exhaust them quickly and deplete their effectiveness in combat. So now the Russian player Von Mountain kind of has to play for time while the rest of his troops get into position, and the Prussian player doesn't seem like he's ready to stand by and let him do it. He's going to move forward here with more overwhelming force, several companies of musketeers, and they're going to move forward and engage in some skirmish fighting with the Russian musketeers, who have taken shelter in this copse of trees. It's pretty terrifying if you look at it. Can't really see the enemy. You can see the dust clouds of their march, but you know that they're there, and you know that they're coming for you. Pretty scary. Pretty terrifying, I have to say. Now the Prussians have got themselves into a strong position. They're going to be able to just open fire on that woods. They know the Russians are in there. Here we go. Oh, wait for it. Looks like Von Mountain is now going to try and mobilize some of his Opolsheny reserves, try and hold this line here against an overwhelming Prussian advantage in men, and now a fairly even fight in terms of cavalry. The Lancer battalions here looking a little bit bloodied, medium casualties here on one of them, but still very healthy, still very combat ready. And now the Prussians are going to start to take a position relative to the woods. The Russians are going to open fire, revealing their position, and the Prussians are going to return fire. And it's going to be nasty. The Russians falling by the dozens in the face of that overwhelming firepower. You can see the Prussians over there just through the tree line. Wait for it. The Russians certainly doing their best to try and hold out here, but it doesn't seem like the Prussians are too interested in an extended skirmish assault here through the woods. It is providing the Russians with a fair amount of cover, allowing them to inflict some fairly disproportionate casualties. So I think what we could see here fairly shortly is a charge from the infantry, and indeed that is what we're going to see. The Russians, having been sufficiently weakened, lost about 60 of their men. And the Prussians are going to move in with 2 companies of their musketeers and begin to charge against them. What we got going on over here? Someone's general is under attack. By who? There's no one over here. Lies. The musketeers are being soundly beaten by their Prussian counterparts. Overwhelming numbers here, just too much for this unit. But it is buying von Mountain some time at the very least. It is taking the Prussians quite a while to get themselves into position, and von Mountain has managed to at least form some stable, organized resistance with his Opolsheny reserves here. But now it looks like he's going to fall back again. Slightly reposition his musketeers here, try to bleed the Prussians on the approach, and even out the numerical advantage that the Prussians have. And they're trying to dislodge these musketeers from the hills, but the hill provides them with a lot of cover. Meanwhile, the targets that the Russian musketeers are sighting are very much within their field of fire. So while the Russians on the hill are not quite immune, they are certainly very well protected. What we got over here? Oh, I missed it. Some Russian Uhlans charging down against the Prussian Grenadiers. The Grenadiers were able to form square and devastate those Uhlans, cutting down almost half their number and routing them. And the Uhlans were essentially completely ineffective, unable to do anything about it. The Prussians took no losses. That's painful for von Mountain, but it does herald the return of his flanking units. Oh, and looks like they are actually going to rout off the field too, so von Mountain isn't going to get that unit of cavalry back. Now it's basically dead even in terms of the numbers of cavalry on the field. Von Mountain has arrived with some infantry, some much needed support. And the Prussians have formed themselves up in the field, but there's no Russian army for them to fight at the moment. The Opolsheny have declined to fight the brunt of the Prussian army out in the field, which is probably for the best. And von Mountain is just bleeding section dry with his musketeers, very adeptly placed up here on the hill. Yep, you can just see a lot of damage has been done to the Prussian army, just generally across the entirety of their units. And the Russian musketeers up here are holding their ground well. Another company of musketeers have been brought forward, and there is still some high ground for von Mountain to occupy. If the Prussians decide to assault this position, it would be very, very costly, I think. Yeah, some musketeers moving to take position up here on the hill. Von Mountain has reacted to the movement of the Prussian army, I think, quite adroitly, and put himself in a position where, despite his numerical inferiority, he is able to deal some pretty disproportionate casualties to the Prussians while he maneuvers the rest of his forces into position. And it seems like most of the Russians have managed to meet up with each other. So now I think might be the time when we start to see the really decisive engagements begin to take place. Although the Russian musketeers are really giving it to the Prussians, but there's just not enough of them. More musketeers taking position up here on the hill. And it looks like the Prussians might be going for a tried and true tactic here. They were able to rout a numerically inferior battalion of musketeers earlier with a bayonet charge. Looks like the Russian player, von Mountain, has actually checked this advance with a wave of Opolsheny who are barreling towards the Prussian positions. The Prussian player isn't going to take that lying down, however. You can see Lancer companies moving in against the Opel-Shenny. Oh, they are going to carry through with that momentum into the stragglers. The Russians are going to try and form themselves up into a square, and it looks like they will be successful at least. And that is going to check the advance of the Prussian Lancers. But that does put them at a disadvantage against the Prussian infantry who are nearby and able to support the cavalry charges, which is something that I think the Prussian player has done incredibly well. He supported his cavalry charges with his infantry, whereas Von Mountain hasn't been able to do that quite so much. He ran over his own infantry by running through them, and then, of course, there was that fateful charge of the Uhlans against the, wherever that happened to take place. I think it was farther back here. Yeah, against the entrenched grenadiers. They were able to destroy them handily and rout them off the field. Fierce firefight here in the center between the Russians and the Prussian infantry. And the Prussians are actually taking a fair amount of damage from this. Russians maybe moving forward with some cavalry? No? The Prussians have sent some of their infantry around onto Von Mountain's left flank, trying to circumvent the Russian position, which is very, very strong up here on the hill. Opel-Shenny charging forward, seeing that the Prussians are a little bit on the back foot. And the sheer numbers of the Opel-Shenny, I think, might be enough to overwhelm these musketeers. Another charge from the Opel-Shenny here in the center. But yes, the Prussian cavalry to the rescue, getting a beautiful rear and flanking charge into the Opel-Shenny. And the other Lancer company here supporting the Prussian musketeers, who were quite hard pressed by the Opel-Shenny. Von Mountain's going to counter with some Uhlans, some Lancer cavalry of his own. Some of the Prussians are going to form themselves up into a square. This is going to be a slaughterhouse for both sides. It looks like one of the Prussian Lancer companies were shattered by the Uhlans and the combination of infantry. And that's going to leave the musketeers here alone to face off against the cavalry, which they are doing quite well. They're holding their ground well. But the victorious Opel-Shenny, still much reduced, but nonetheless, are going to move in here against this infantry square. And the Uhlan cavalry is going to push through, and that's going to break up this square. Bad news for the Prussian player, who previously, to this point in the battle, was so dominant. The Opel-Shenny in the center doing their best against the musketeers, but the musketeers are by far more skilled. And the Opel-Shenny are beginning to desert in numbers. These troops are starting to waver. These guys are still confident, but they're running away, and that's going to bring another wave of Prussian infantry with them. Some grenadiers have formed up. Fresh companies of grenadiers. And now this Russian position has become untenable. They've overextended themselves in the center. They are surrounded. The Opel-Shenny are beginning to break. One good thing for Von Mountain, at least, is that he's managed to break through with 2 companies of his Uhlans. And now those 2 units of grenadiers have rushed the Russian position. But they're tired. And while they're doing decently enough, these 2 units here, this engagement might end up in these units being wiped out completely. Von Mountain's going to see an opportunity and come in with his Lancers and hit those grenadiers from behind. And that is going to be all she wrote for these brave, I would say more elite Prussian troops. And they're going to shatter. That's some shattering right there. That company is completely gone. Von Mountain's going to quickly move to the other side as well. And a rear charge there is going to cause their morale to plummet. They are wavering. I think we're going to see some shattering here. Indeed. At least the Prussians have something to show for all of this blood. They have taken the center. They very nicely, you have to hand to the Prussian player. Again, he surrounded Von Mountain's position in the center. He managed to basically surround the infantry rush, break down the Opel-Shenny, and destroy some of the musketeers, I believe, that were down here as well. You can see some musketeers running away. There's still a Russian company up here. The 2 now victorious units of Russian musketeers were able to take up a strong position uphill against the Prussians, but he's done well. He's destroyed this offensive in the center, and if he was able to destroy the 2 companies of Uhlans that were remaining, then this might be a far different story. These guys would still be fighting the grenadiers, and yeah, the Prussians would, I think at that point that would be decisive for the Prussians. So Von Mountain coming around with those Uhlans has certainly kept him in the game. So that was some quick thinking on his part. Excellent work on the part of Von Mountain. Prussians are advancing, doing everything that they can, forming up. They're going to launch a few volleys here, I mentioned, into the Russian musketeers, try and break down this position. They certainly still have an advantage in terms of the numbers of infantry, but Von Mountain has the cavalry fight well in hand. There's almost no cavalry left over, in fact, except for the Prussian general staff. Ooh, what do we got here? A beautiful pincer move by the Prussians against this lone battalion of Russian reserves. Oh, the Russians are going to move forward and try and encircle these guys in turn. The general staff going to move forward, break up that charge, and the Prussian musketeers will turn around and charge down the Russians in turn. This is a tough fight. Cavalry squares here fending off the Russian cavalry, doing their best, but the Russians are actually going to come in force against one of the very heavily reduced battalions of grenadiers. Some support is available by the Prussian musketeers. They're going to rout these Russian musketeers. Uhlans, however, are going to charge into the rear of the Prussians. This is rough. This is really ugly. More Russians coming in. The general staff from the Russians moving to confront the general staff of the Prussians. Fairly evenly matched in terms of numbers. And this is going to be it. This is for all the marbles here. A couple companies of Prussian infantry routing off the fields. The Russians are now winning that infantry fight. Prussians rushing everything that they can in here. Some more grenadiers joining the fight. General staff versus, I think the Russian general staff is in here too. Indeed they are. It's a total slaughterhouse. This is it. This is the decisive engagement of this battle. Looks like the Prussian general staff might be trying to retire, trying to get away from the Uhlans. They're down to 9. The Russians are still at 14. They've managed to disengage their general. And they're chasing down... well, maybe they're just running along the same path. Somebody's starting to break. That would be the Russian Uhlans. This is looking bad for the Russian player. Lots of Prussian musketeers and infantry still left over. I don't think Von Mountain really has anything left over to answer this with. General staff moving in. Some Uhlans here have managed to rout Prussian infantry, and they're going to charge in from the rear. Pincer moving here with the Russian cavalry. I don't know what's going to happen. This is so close. Still some Russian infantry in there. I thought the Prussians had it in the bag, but maybe not. Where's the Prussian general? Oh, the Prussians are beginning to break. I think maybe the Prussian general broke or was killed at some point. And that is going to leave the Russians in command of the field. That was just such a good game. It's a shame that it took me so long to get to it. Such a good game. It looks like the numbers there of Von Mountain managed to win out against the quality of Section 13. But damn if that wasn't a good battle. Section supports his infantry very well with his cavalry. A beautiful combined arms approach to warfare. He was able to zero in early on the weaknesses in Von Mountain's deployment, which put him on the defensive for much of the game. Von Mountain, though, you have to hand it to him, maneuvering was very, very adept. The Prussians pressed him, he fell back, he gave ground until he had a beautiful defensive position, which Section 13 was then obliged to assault unless he wanted to continuously play Ring Around the Rosie with Von Mountain. And he was being constantly bled the whole time by those two companies of musketeers that were positioned on the high ground. Very, very well played to both sides. This was a pleasure to watch. My name is Jordan, also known as JMonster. I hope you guys enjoyed this battle, and I'll see you next time with some Silmarillion Total War. Until then, take care, everybody.